the International Court of Justice, the primary judicial organ of the United Nations, of which all states who are members of the UN are also party and subject to its jurisdiction, right, has decided that there's enough evidence for plausible genocide. Okay, so we know a lot, and we know that the Center for Constitutional Rights has recently sued the Biden administration, specifically President Biden, Secretary of State Blinken, Secretary of Defense, Austin, for their failure to comply with the Genocide Convention, which contrary to, I think, our popular understanding of it, isn't just the manifestation of the aftermath of decimation, but the primary call and stipulation of this convention is the prevention of genocide. And so we know enough to know that there is a duty to prevent it, right? So then what is the United States doing in its role, knowing that 2 days ago, it issued its third veto at the Security Council in contravention of the international community's will and desire to stem what we are about to see in Rafah, the last standing city in Gaza, that if subject to invasion, would result in the achievement of Israel's unstated goal, or stated amongst themselves, right, which is the depopulation of the Gaza Strip and its resettlement in the name of security, what I've described as, in the form of Zionist math, which never adds up, as Nakba peace. Achieving sustainable peace through ethnic cleansing and removal, right? And so, given how much we know, given that the United States has now contravened the will of 153 states who supported the Uniting for Peace or General Assembly Resolution 377 twice, Secretary General Antonio Guterres' invocation of Article 99, also an extraordinary invocation to demand ceasefire. Given that the U.S. is on notice, it has enough to know, and it's still contravening these calls. I don't know that there's the answer to the question, is there a prima facie case? In our world, yes. In our world, yes. In the legal world, it's always going to be a debate and a battle. It's always going to be a debate and a battle. And one of the primary battles that's happening is the terrain on law that we fight. So the Republic of South Africa brought this case using the Genocide Convention, wanting to fight on that terrain, wanting to demonstrate that there was specific intent to destroy a people in whole or in part based on their racial, ethnical, national, or religious identity, together with the specific acts in order to do so, right? And knowing that of the 5 specific acts, right, only one of them is mass killings. So that genocide is not evident to us or present because of how many people are killed, but instead because of the intent. And here's the distinction between genocide and other forms of war, where war crimes and crimes against humanity feature. It's the purpose. The purpose of genocide as destruction is illegitimate. The purpose of war is legitimate, possibly with horrible outcomes. And so this is why you have the Israeli legal team almost conceding, right? At least the jurists are conceding, not necessarily its representatives are conceding, that Israel has committed war crimes, has committed crimes against humanity, which is the systematic targeting of civilians. But there's a difference between the systematic targeting of civilians as a crime against humanity, right, that happens in the course of war, and since the International Criminal Tribunal on Yugoslavia happens also in peacetime, versus the targeting of a group with the intent to destroy it. So I would say, based on what we know, and primarily based on what Palestinians are telling us, and here's the work of listening to survivors, and a really difficult mandate to do, where racism is really characterizing this entire discussion, so that we don't believe Palestinian survivors in particular, right? We barely see them as featuring. President Biden, on 100 days of this genocide, didn't even mention the 10,000 Palestinian children who were killed. Didn't even mention the U.S. Palestinian Americans who have been targeted and paralyzed and attacked with chemical weapons, and at Stanford run over by drivers. Didn't even mention his own constituents, let alone the 10,000 children who were killed. So, you know, it's easy. It's not hyperbolic of me to say, it's not that we don't matter, we don't even exist in this American imagination. And then our mandate is, listen to us, tell you what's happening to us. In that universe, yeah, of course it's prima facie. But in the world that we live in, it's a battle. And unfortunately, in legal terms, that battle is so far away from your moral compass. It's basically, are we going to decide this as a matter of genocide? Are we going to decide this as a matter of war and IHL? And so we can talk about this more later, but the ICC is largely going to take this up as an IHL matter, humanitarian law. And here we see the ICJ take this up as a genocide matter, and I think we'll get to this later. I don't think that the ICJ, based on its jurisprudence on genocide, is necessarily going to find that this is genocide at the later stage of proceedings on the merits. So here's, my little word to us. We have to continuously use the law as a tool without faith in it. Yeah, so that's the beginning.
So, Noura, on that very point, we have to use law without having faith in it. So, I come from history, and a lot of people in critical theory will always tell us that law itself has always been a weapon for the powerful. And as you know, and as you just pointed out, is used and is selectively applied and not applied. Why have faith in law? What do you tell law students here in particular? Why have faith in these institutions that have so often let the global south and the third world and the oppressed of the world down?
100%. If my professors will vouch this, I barely made it through the institution, knowing, wait a minute, I'm first generation. English is my second language, first generation law student. I really thought that I was coming to a freedom school when I got into law school. I know that's hilarious, right? And then was horribly disappointed and thought, we're reproducing power? In fact, when we invoke the law, we're reifying its legitimacy? Isn't it a source of our domination and oppression? And that vexed me. So I'm going to answer this question first on a personal level and then on the more theoretical level, if that's okay. But on a personal level, I took that anyway and decided, well, we can make the best of it. Surely we can make the best of it. Graduated law school in 2005, wanted to be a Palestinian human rights attorney, except in 2005, we're basically at the tail end of the Second Intifada. There's no such thing as Palestinian human rights, right? It's either the perversion of peace and conflict studies, because somehow we haven't broken enough bread with one another, right? Where power drops off the bottom, or it's absolutely squared as a national security issue. And you have to understand Palestinians through a counterterrorism framework. So to say Palestinian human rights in that moment made no sense, and it didn't. I got a fellowship for $35,000 a year and made my own job. In order to sue, with debt, to sue Israeli alleged war criminals in the United States under the Alien Tort Statute. And Professor Buxbaum was my professor on that independent research paper, where I started to explore that idea. In both those cases, we sued Dichter in the DC District Court, Avi Dichter, and we sued, in New York, Southern District of New York, we sued Moshe Alon in the DC District Court. Both cases were dismissed within a year on grounds of non-justiciability, political question doctrine, that there's another branch of government more suited to answer this question, or that you cannot sue a foreign government in US courts unless they fall under the Plateau Amendment, and that's another story. I'll spare you that. We didn't get to go to court. The survivors never had their day in court. So I pivoted and then went to work on the Hill to figure out how law works. Then I pivoted and traveled to Gaza on a legal fact-finding mission in 2009, because these are systematic attacks that have been happening. And then I pivoted and worked on behalf of the Refugee Badil, refugee agency at the United Nations, and pivoted again into the academy, and I keep pivoting to answer this question, right? How is it that Palestinians can advance their struggle for liberation, and specifically with the toolbox that I have, What is the relationship between law and power, and what does that relationship tell us about that emancipatory potential of the law? Right? The outcome of that inquiry is my book, Justice for Some. So quickly, the answer to the question, the way I come to it, there's kind of a spectrum of how we understand international law. There's a school of thought that squares the Marxists, the critical legal theorists, and the political realists in one school that understands law as power, and it's law as a fiction. It's a fig leaf for power with which to batter the weaker countries. And that makes a lot of sense to us today, I'm sure, when we're seeing the crime of all crimes, right? Unable to overcome and stop it, despite all of these legal institutions and treaties and bodies of law that are supposed to stop it. So it makes sense, that's the most logical one, right? Versus another school of thought, I would say that the other side of this spectrum, which understand the positivists, who understand the law of having its own meaning, right? That it could be studied by a science to be revealed, and you study the language of law, the drafting history, and so on and so forth, which I think, is almost what in Marty Koskiniemi's words would be the utopia of law. I end up somewhere here, close, definitely closer to the Marxists and the critical legal theorists, right? But not quite understanding law as apology, but understanding law as having emancipatory potential. The question is when. The question is when. And I say that we should understand law as power, and to be yielded and to be used in the service of emancipatory struggles. It has to be yielded in a sophisticated service of political movements. I think like a movement lawyer. If there is robust movement that can shape and apply the meaning of law, then use it. And if there isn't, then it's likely that law will be used against us. So I use an analogy to think of the law like the sail of a boat. You need a sail to move, but wind will determine your direction. If the law is the sail, the wind is politics. Pull up the sail when the wind is blowing in your direction, draw it when it's blowing against us, create a new sail when possible. But the question still remains, but why law at all? And here my answer is, I think it's inescapable. In the same way that the balance of power is inescapable, in the same way that I think economics are inescapable, I think that it's a reality that we contend with without relying on it. And in fact, the history of the Palestinian freedom struggle, though I show between 1917 and 2017 that Israel has used the law far more to its advantage to advance its settler colonial ambitions than Palestinians have used it, we have had moments where it's been used quite effectively, specifically in 1974, where the PLO establishes the juridical status of Palestinians with the right to self-determination and reinscribes itself as a people, where the Balfour Declaration of 1917 and the Palestine Mandate of 22 erased that status. And I think that, in 1975, Fayez Sayegh, who is the director of the Palestine Research Center in Beirut, works on behalf of the Kuwaiti delegation to amend the Decade Against Racism, to insert the word Zionism everywhere this was I'm like, you remember, right? Decade Against Racism was an initiative of several African states in order to delegitimize the apartheid regime in South Africa and Namibia, known as Southwest Africa. And so they passed this resolution in order to hold, review of racism across the world. The first human rights treaty, by the way, is actually the Convention for the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. That's the first one, but it's just not ratified before the other ones because so many states are practicing it. Let's put that on the side. There is an amendment to this resolution to insert the word Zionism everywhere the word racism, colonialism, and apartheid appear, resulting in Resolution 3379, declaring Zionism as a form of racism and racial discrimination. The Palestinians rescind that in 1991 as a precondition for entering into the peace process. Right? 1977, last one, I'm just going to tell you, the PLO works with the non-aligned movement and the G77 in order to basically create new law for guerrillas to fight. So guerrillas, who are considered criminals and terrorists and illegitimate use of force, are in that moment, because of additional protocols 1 and 2 to the Geneva Convention in 1977, recognized as soldiers and combatants with the right to fight. So this is all the work of what at that point was an instant majority in the General Assembly by the Global South. In order to create this law, they were stitching new sails for themselves, right? Which demonstrates for us that even in our own history of a stateless people against the only nuclear power in the Middle East, we're able to use the law to our advantage in this way. So I think that we still have that opportunity, but we have to use it cynically and strategically as we move forward.
Thank you for that, Noura. That's an incredible answer, and of course, because the other side and the powerful always use law strategically and cynically all the time. And so I guess on that, what is the significance to you of the fact that it's post-apartheid South Africa that brought the case to the attention of the ICJ, as opposed to the Arab states, for example? But just the fact that apartheid, post-apartheid South Africa, the people who suffered under apartheid are the ones who brought this case. How is that significant? How does that, in a sense, repudiate the very narrative you just said of 75 is the UN resolution, which is then rescinded as a condition of the so-called peace process, which we know ended up in just entrenching Israeli occupation of the West Bank, of East Jerusalem, and the oppression in Gaza. How does the fact that South Africa wants to bring this case, how is that significant in terms of...
Well, I'm sure you're feeling it too. I feel your happy energy. Like there's few things I think that made us happy. Seeing the Republic of South Africa was one of those moments. You know, let me step back and answer this question by saying, what South Africa represents to us is the answering of a moral question unequivocally. That racial colonial domination is immoral, not merely illegal, but immoral. And so it is that power, not of the law, but of that morality that is guiding us, right? Think about the fact that apartheid is criminalized as a crime against humanity in 1973. Apartheid falls by 1991, but not a single case, past or present, has ever been brought against anyone for the crime of apartheid in South Africa. So the law was mobilizing this moral question to basically delegitimize the ideology of apartheid, which is a lesson for us now in our thinking about what role is the law playing. It might not play the role that we expect it to in courts and indictments and trials, as much as it'll play this role of answering a moral question in tandem with movement, which is answering it robustly, right? But South Africa is also very unique in what we're seeing right now shape as a battle between the global South and the global North on the question of the legitimacy of the use of force against native peoples. Most of Western civilization, and certainly settler colonies, including this one, and Canada, and New Zealand, and Australia, right, have all been built on genocides that aren't recognized as such because they precede its proscription in the Genocide Convention in 1948. And in fact, genocide isn't visible as a crime until it happens within Europe's shores, in a way that when it's proscribed almost absolves that it took place in the colonial geographies first. And in the words of Aimé Césaire, Martinican, founder of the Negritude movement and writer and the organic intellectual, explains to us, Hitler learned, right, these methods from the experience of Germany, for example, in Namibia between 1904 and 1907, in the genocide of the Herero Nama peoples, which doesn't get recognized. All right, so then bringing this up to this moment, South Africa, more than that, in its moment of fighting for its liberation, its two primary opponents to ending apartheid are the United States and Israel. Literally, Israel first enables the South African apartheid regime to withstand sanctions during the boycott campaign of South Africa. They are in close alliance and are actually sharing nuclear intelligence, right? And the United States is using its veto power to protect the apartheid regime at the Security Council. And if you bean count, like some nerds might, the use of veto power by the United States after its use to protect Israel was used to protect Namibia and South Africa, apartheid in Namibia and South Africa. They are living this very moment, despite our revisionist history that celebrates Nelson Mandela and the apartheid movement. We were its primary obstacles. And in 1974, in fact, it was under the leadership of Abdelaziz Bouteflika, who's the first foreign minister of Algeria who becomes the General Assembly president. They want to unseat apartheid South Africa from the UN in 1974. But who has plenary power over membership? This is the teacher hat on. Well, if you think about the Palestine, case of becoming a member state, who gets to make the final decision of who's a member of the UN? It's the Security Council. It's the Security Council, which is why the General Assembly can recognize Palestine as a state, but it's not a member state because only the Security Council can decide. Well, in 1974, the same was true. Only the Security Council can unseat South Africa. But who didn't want to unseat them? Britain, France, the United States. Take it easy. You can't be that hostile. You need to slowly bring South Africa into the fold. Palestine is not unique in this condition. So Bouteflika, together with an automatic majority at the General Assembly, changed the rules. They created new sale and create new law for the General Assembly to be able to unseat South Africa despite Security Council opposition and successfully do so. So you might be immediately asking, oh my God, then why don't the Palestinians unseat Israel? They tried multiple times. And back onto Arab states, one of the primary opponents to that move has been Egypt. In the 1970s, because of its desire to recoup the Sinai Peninsula through negotiations and needing to be within the United States' sphere of influence, and in the present, today, because of its own vested interests.
Wow. So Noura, on that very point, there's a couple of points. One is when you think about, you said global north and global south, and of course South Africa and post-apartheid South Africa represents, a moral beacon for so many around the world because of course, the struggle against apartheid and the victory over the struggle over apartheid, and the fact that they mobilized and were able, the ANC, and Nelson Mandela in particular, was able to mobilize a global community in favor of abolishing apartheid. And so too the fact that now there's a global struggle on behalf of Palestine. So my question, do you think the global north and global south as rigid geographies should be rethought? I mean, there are so many people, young people, especially in the global north, who are mobilizing for Palestine everywhere. Does that make us rethink global north and global south? Or how does that make you reflect on it?
Oh, I love this question, yeah. So one of the things I would say is yes and. Because there is still a demarcation between, former colonial powers and former colonized peoples. So there still is a demarcation that's marked by uneven development, right, by uneven sovereignty and the rights of sovereignty that I think still do distinguish these geographies. I mean, I think that's evident when you think about the ICC's jurisprudence since its establishment in 2002. It hasn't prosecuted the United States for its war crimes, for its illegitimate use of force to attack Iraq, and basically dismantle the state, the Iraqi state as it existed in 2003. It hasn't taken Israel to, we could talk about that. But the point is that they've only indicted Arab and African heads of state to date with the exception of Slobodan Milosevic. So there is something to be said about this unevenness of global north and global south that I do want to acknowledge that is being vivid, is on vivid display in this moment. We can see it. right? When we saw the intervention at the ICJ to support South Africa's application, it was very stark. Nicaragua, Maldives, right? Malaysia, Namibia, so on and so forth, versus Germany, the United States, Canada, in support of Israel. So we see that division. But you bring up this incredible point, which is that these demarcations aren't clean. And so much of the global south is actually located in the global north. And here I draw on the Black radical tradition, which aligns itself, right, the Black radical tradition as envisioning that Black people in the United States are actually part of the global south. And so that the struggle against imperialism that unites brown and Black peoples of the world, from China to Cuba to the Palestinians and the Algerians, includes African Americans, right? And so understanding that there is a third world within the first world, which Black Palestinian solidarity also illuminates for us, right? Illuminates for us that the United States isn't just a site of really grotesque racism, but is a site of colonial domination, an ongoing colonial domination of those that it marks as other, as racialized others, as threats, as sites of exploitation, as the communities who will not have an equal right to life, and who will be subject, in the words of Ruth E. Wilson Gilmore, to premature death as a fact of common sense, right? They explain that through a colonial analysis and an anti-colonial analysis. So recognizing now the robustness of the global south in the global north geography is a continuation, I think, of an analysis and of a tradition, which, by the way, was never, I mean, if you're thinking, you know, it was never even. That even if it's in its heyday, as it's being led by the Black Panther Party and the SNCC and other organizations, right, the revolutionary Black organizations and the Communist Party and so on, even in that moment, it was a division between radical Black political intellectual movements and more mainstream ones, like the Urban League and the NAACP, which made clear that even in a movement for anti-racism, class matters and class interests matter. So that what does prevail is the interest of a middle-class Black community that wants to see the Constitution meet its full potential of being equal participants in the state, regardless of if the state is an imperial power. Versus a more radical tradition that understood there is no full emancipation without a full confrontation with imperialism. And so I think those things are very much on full display now and become part of the conversation that we're having. Palestine is inviting us to do that. Palestine is inviting us to do that. Because unlike other places where colonialism is not as evident and as stark, here it's blatant. And so it helps illuminate how it exists and functions in other parts of the world.
Absolutely correct. And so the question then is the fact that it's so blatant is also because of the anachronism of what's going on. I mean, we're in 2024, and we're seeing forms of colonialism that really are antiquated in the sense they're 19th century, as you said earlier. You mentioned Australia, you mentioned New Zealand, you mentioned the United States and Canada. The 19th and early 20th century forms of colonialism that we see in the 21st century. It's kind of shocking. And so again, you're absolutely right. There's a sense that this is a global issue. This is a moral touchstone around the world that traverses these geographies of global north and global south, without, as you said, without diminishing this idea of the differences and the stark realities of colonialism and the effects of colonialism and inequality and racism. So what advice would you give to, on that, there's a couple of questions that come to mind. One is, given the mixing of geographies and the fact that the third world or the global south is in the global north right now, and many of these people are in law schools, you yourself, you said you were at Berkeley, you were here, in fact, you were a product of Berkeley Law, and I'm sure they're very proud of you, because we are all proud of you. The question, Noura, well, the ones who are discerning are proud of you, those who are not are really. But the question is, can law schools, do you think, be a place of radicalization in the best sense of the term? And then what advice, furthermore, what advice do you give, given, or let's start with that, and then I want to ask you about the extraordinary backlash that we see, because as you said, Palestine has become a touchstone, it's become a moral cause that traverses so many different cultures and geographies and peoples and states around the world. It's an extraordinary mobilization, unlike any previous time. But there's also a backlash. So we'll get to
Do you want to start there? Do you want to start?
backlash?
Yeah.
No, go ahead. Yeah, you go ahead.
Only because it touches on the question that we had before about the global south and the global north.
Yeah, sure.
Right?
Yeah,
I think
yes.
that's quite, it's relevant. There's a bridge there.
Yeah.
And also, thank you for naming the anachronism. Obviously, the historian in the room, preeminent historian in the room, is going to name for us the oddity of this moment and why we feel like we're being gaslit. Right? So since 1948, supposedly, obviously this is taken apart by Samuel Moyn and others, but this idea that since 1948 we live in a human rights era, now we understand individuals as being rights-bearing agents under international law, that states are actually a source of harm and need to be protected from them, even though the UN Charter is primarily, if you read it, stating the rights of states, not to be confused with the rights of the nations within those states, who might not be represented. So there is an anachronism to understanding, but since this moment, we've understood a different sense of decency, of morality. Colonialism is condemned in 1960 as an illegitimate form of governance, and that was a battle to pass Resolution 1514. That was a battle, because up until that moment, colonialism is seen as a good. It's bringing plumbing. It's bringing civilization. It's bringing better gendered relationships, right? It's bringing family planning. It's bringing modern medicine, right? And so much so that we even see revisionist articles thinking about, well, maybe colonialism wasn't so bad. Or if you go to Florida, where they want to teach us that, enslaved peoples benefit. Right? But these are the battlegrounds upon which we stand. And so colonialism was declared illegitimate, racism has been declared illegitimate, right? Genocide has been declared illegitimate, and yet in this very moment, when we are bearing witness to it, it's not the first genocide. Palestinians are not the first to endure an apocalypse. Ask the Lakota and the Dakota. Ask the Ohlone peoples, and where I'm now at, the Lenape peoples, about apocalypse. But this is the first genocide that we are watching in real time. There's no filter. There's no filter in this moment. And yet, merely for naming it, for looking at it and then saying what you see, you are being punished. We are being punished, which is the skill of repression. And it is. The repression isn't just about protecting Israel. What's at stake here is protecting this colonial order. The stake here is about protecting the hierarchy and the supremacy of European powers. The stake here is about protecting and absolving colonialism, even from some sort of criminal review, as enshrined in the Rome Statute and elsewhere. Rome Statute 1998, which an embodiment of international criminal laws. It's articulated that gives rise to the International Criminal Court. Of the core crimes, colonialism is not one of them. This is what's at stake in this moment. The repression against you is both a protection of all of that order, as well as, right, being a mechanism by which to forward a lot of right-wing interests, especially on university campuses. We're told that this is about Palestine. We're told that this is about the definition of anti-Semitism. But this is part of a long concerted campaign that has seen a right-wing campaign that sees the university space as too liberal, too left, too woke. It's not producing enough compliant workers. Okay? And so part of the movement to win that battle is to use the battle against anti-Semitism and protecting Jewish students on campus with what could be more noble. Seriously, what could be more noble? But to pervert that noble cause in order to forward a right-wing supremacist agenda predicated on genocide in this moment. So I do think that what we're enduring in the global north is primarily what the bodies of colonized peoples have endured. And this is also imbricated in a long history of US forms of state violence, law enforcement, and military both in mind, where much of our law enforcement is a reflection and a continuation of the US's military forces as it becomes an imperial military following the Spanish-American War and its conquest at that time of the Philippines, Guam, Puerto Rico, and Cuba, where now those technologies of how to maintain those territories is also translated back into how do you police the other, the racialized other in the United States. And so never to separate those two things, and I think that that's, in our thinking about repression, is to think about the entwinement here, and not the separation. You can't really, you can't really stop working on Palestine, because you would be really surrendering yourselves. And the battle before us here. There are entwinements. Palestine happens in this moment, this earth-shattering moment, to be the embodiment of the struggle for us all and uniting us across the globe. But this is very much our battle here as well.
Thank you, Noura. So do you think on that, again, it's our battle, it's a global battle. It's our battle, and it's a global battle, but the question is, do you think that this right-wing attack that you've mentioned, and the censorship, and the extraordinary deluge of misinformation, disinformation, and doxing of Palestinian, Arab, Muslim allied students, faculty, staff, and others who work on this issue, do you think it's diminishing in efficacy, is one question right now? And then what do you tell the students, particularly law, not just the law students, all the undergraduates and graduate students here, what do you tell them, and what strategies or what will you tell them in terms of, given the enormity of the backlash and the censorship and the intimidation and the gaslighting, as you said, gaslighting on an epic scale, on a genocide scale, in fact, what do you tell the students, how do they proceed in the face of this? Is the gaslighting effective, do you think? Is it diminishing in efficacy? And what do you tell the students?
Yeah, that's a tough one. That's a tough one. Because all of us have unequal circumstances as well. There are some of us who aren't documented. So I can't provide you the same answer I would provide, I don't know, somebody who might be white appearing and cisgendered, right? Who maybe, has a lot of means at their disposal to defend themselves in connections with their families to make some phone call. So it's an even question for us of what kind of risks do we take? Because all of this is about taking risks. All of this is about taking risks. So that would be really an individualized assessment. You have to make that decision, right? Not only the risk that you can take, the risk that you're willing to take, the risk that is worth taking, right? So I want to think, I'm just thinking strategically with you here. Like, not all battles are the same. We have to be thinking, what is the greatest source of our agency? And how do we apply ourselves? So does it make sense to disrupt a talk by a speaker whom we disagree with? Maybe. Who is that speaker, right? I draw the line for me, for example, okay, if I think that somebody is an accused war criminal and should be on trial, obviously this is an improper venue to do some respectability politics. But if it's just somebody with a different idea than mine, let them speak and drown them out, right? Don't take the risk, for example, in that moment of being disciplined by the university, of having now to get all your friends out of, those disciplinary proceedings, of diverting your resources. Your battle will shift in that moment, right? And all that to say, I'm not saying not to do it. I'm just saying we have to be strategic, that all of these are like case by case by case assessments of moving forward. But then there's the other question. What do I tell folks? What do I tell folks? In addition to making that decision for yourself, is the thing that I said earlier. What do you stand to lose when you say nothing?
Everything.
Right? We all think forefront, what do we stand to lose when we do something? My job, my reputation, my peace, right? But what do you stand to lose when you do nothing? What is moving forward in a world that quietly watched a genocide unfold? What do our values matter in that world? What future are we leaving for our children and our children's children in that world? Who is safe in that world, right? If Israel can with ease and convenience, destroy the Palestinian people based on talking points that are easily dismantled, and I'm so frustrated with the journalistic corps because they're easily dismantled, easily, right? By citing other news reports, just cite your own journalists, right? I was on the BBC where I had to listen to the spokesperson right before me, who explained that it was Hamas that was confiscating the humanitarian aid that was entering and then selling it on a black market at a price gouging in a moment so that they can benefit. And the journalist was like, okay, let me ask you the next question. 2 days earlier, Israeli naval commandos actually shot at UN convoys to destroy the humanitarian aid. I'm not asking you to be an advocate, I'm asking you to be a journalist, right? And so there's too much ease, it's too easy to do this. And the risk that poses is, what can other states do to the populations they don't like or are inconvenient to them, right? When Myanmar decides, yeah, these Rohingya are taking up too much space. Or when a Hindutva movement decides these Muslims are the source of the harm of this country and undermining our glory. What happens when we allow a precedent like this to be established for all other peoples that can be marked for removal and to be removed with ease? So that's the question. I would tell you, what do you stand to lose by doing nothing?
I think that's an excellent question. And what struck me, Noura, is the fact that so many students, precarious, employed faculty, staff, graduate students as well, have spoken out. And how many tenured faculty have not spoken out?
Wow.
That's what I'm not talking just about UC Berkeley, I'm talking across the board. I mean, how many people, so it's quite interesting that people do make this ethical choice. And it is quite remarkable in that sense. But I guess I'd like to push you on one point about the Palestine exception. And since I know you've worked on this and you've talked about this a lot, and you're absolutely right, Palestine is not the only place where genocide has occurred, you know that. But it's as a historian, we work on, we study, we teach the various genocides of the past, but we've never been in a situation where we're witnessing it unfold before our eyes, where the perpetrators are live streaming their own genocide. There's so much documentation. So the question I have is, I guess, why? I mean, you've answered this in a certain way, but I'm going to push you a little bit more. Why is there this exception right now when there's so much overwhelming evidence about the extraordinary cruelty, the starvation, the dehydration, the annihilation, the bombing, the destruction of every university in Gaza, the bombing of schools, and everything that we've seen, the killing of the children, exception. Because on campuses, in our places of work, there are still so many who support. And that's what I'm trying to
I
figure out.
know, it's,
I mean,
how do we explain the acceptance of this despite what we see? Because really, there isn't a lot of dispute of the facts, by the way. There isn't a lot of, Israel is not disputing the facts. Israel is not disputing that it gutted Shifa Hospital, right? They're not disputing that they blew up from the bottom up all universities in Gaza. They're not disputing that they targeted residential buildings. There's no dispute as to the facts, right? But they're telling us that the reason for it is not only